All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue with our material. We don't have too much left. As I said, we're on page 8 to 9, basically. So just to review a little bit about what we covered in our last video, we were discussing the flow of urine as far as the path that the urine has to take. If you remember, it's going to start in one location, this little coiled up ball region right up here. As we mentioned, that is going to be the glomerulus, which is basically this coiled up capillary region. That glomerulus is then going to, via high rates of diffusion, pool the waste products, and not only just waste, but also things that you want to reabsorb. Hence why it's kind of going through this loop process. And while it's going through this loop process, the arteries are traveling, or more specifically, the arterioles and capillaries are traveling alongside in order to try to reabsorb as much as possible. It goes down this what we call the loop of Henle, which again we don't have to worry too much about, and then it makes its way through, eventually all the way into what we call the ureter. So today we're going to get a little bit more information on that. So actually, this is one of the things we discussed last video as well. Now that I remember, we discussed how the ureter is a tube. We find two of them because we have two kidneys, right? That just connects from the kidneys all the way to the bladder. The purpose of our ureters is just to make sure that we can send the urine, basically, and just make sure that the urine is traveling in one direction. And again, we discussed how there's different layers, smooth muscle, fibrous tissue, etc. And then again, we talked about this with regard to digestive system, but it's related to the urinary system and it'll be related to the reproductive system. Peristalsis, these contractions that allow things to move in a certain direction. All right. So as far as some new material to get through. So if we talked about the kidneys, which are these like bean-shaped structures that cause the filtration, right? They actually pull apart the waste product. Then we talked about the ureter. Now we have to talk about the balloon-shaped structure that is found in our lower quadrant region, just a little bit above the groin. We have the bladder. So the bladder. Here's what we can see. It's a hollow muscular organ that stores urine. So we have a lot of this muscular tissue, specifically more along the lines of smooth muscle, that surrounds the bladder. There are sphincter muscles that hold the urine in place. Remember, the sphincter muscles, I think of them like these muscular doors that they just contract to contain everything in place. Holds 300 to 400 milliliters of urine before emptying. That is a pretty substantial amount, right? Remember, a milli is a thousandth of something, so we're pretty close to half a liter of urine before having to empty. Granted, when you see that holds 300 to 400 milliliters before emptying, usually around the 200 to 250 mark, do you start to feel like you need the sense of to urinate. Granted, it does depend on the person. Some people have more bladder control, if you want to call it that, than others. Walls contain epithelial tissue that stretch to allow the bladder to hold twice its capacity. The trigon is a triangular area at the base of the bladder where the ureters enter and the urethra exits. So basically, just to kind of show us a little bit of what we're discussing here, we don't need to worry too much about everything, but the trigon is kind of like this triangular shaped, pseudo-shaped region. Now, here's the thing. Something interesting to observe. If I were to show you a picture of just this, right? So just everything here. And I were to ask you, like on a question, can you observe or can you identify the sex of the individual just based off of this? Yes, the answer is yes. And the reason for that is what we see here. In men, they have a specific gland, which you're going to learn more about in reproductive system because it plays a major role in the health of semen. But it's called the prostate gland. Women do not have this gland. So this is something specific to men. So this would be an easy way to identify if it's a male bladder or a male anatomical structure, should we say, or female. Okay. So again, I like to think of the bladder as basically like a balloon. It's going to expand accordingly when you fill it with urine. As it expands more and more, the nervous system is going to get input information from the bladder saying, hey, we're getting pretty full. It might be time to find a bathroom. And then as it expands even further, you start to get really that sense of urgency. Is it possible for the bladder to burst? Yes. the reality is you would have to have incredible, and I'm talking incredible willpower to be able to fight the urge of just urinating on yourself. Obviously as uncomfortable as that would be, and awkward and everything like that, your body kind of flips the switch and says it's either this or a lot of pain and possible death. If the bladder does burst, yeah, you're looking at a serious problem. So it's one of those situations where your body's typically going to kind of push you into doing something because you kind of have to. All right, let's keep moving now. Let's move back to here. There you go. All right, so finally, we have the tube, small tube structure that comes after the bladder, and that's known as the urethra. The urethra is a tube of smooth muscle with a mucus lining that carries urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. That's it. Every single one of us has a urethra. However, you'll notice, depending on the sex of the individual, their urethra can differ. So here's something interesting that we observe. In women, the female urethra is approximately 1.5 inches long, and it opens through what's called the meatus. Again, we'll learn more about this in reproductive system, but women have a separate exit for just the urethra, whereas for men, and just for urine, should we say more specifically, whereas for men, they have one exit, and that one exit is both for urine and for semen in the act of sexual intercourse. So it is something that has to be kind of like situated as far as what is being used and what is being released. First and foremost, before we get into a little bit more about the male urethra, the act of excreting urine does have another name. It's known as voiding or micturition. That's just a more technical name, just how like we mentioned how our mastication was chewing. This is just another more anatomical name for urinating. Now, onto the male urethra. You'll notice that the size is rather different. It's approximately 8 inches long, substantially longer than the female urethra. And the only reason it has to be is because it has to pass through more structures. So, for instance, it has to pass through 3 different regions. We just saw earlier how it has to pass through the prostate gland. The prostate gland is pretty big. It's not substantially large, but it's big enough that it needs to get its way through. The membranous portion, which is just going to honestly be towards the base of the penis, and then, of course, the penis itself. So it does have to travel longer distance. And again, we'll learn more about this in reproductive system, especially when it comes down to men. But it is a rather interesting situation or system in place that basically acts like a. I like to use the word gatekeeper a lot because you can see it with the epiglottis and a couple other structures as well. But maybe more like a railroad switch, that when you flip the switch down, the tracks are going to go in one direction. And then if you flip the switch up, the tracks are going to shift to the right and the train will go to the right. That's the way I kind of envision it in my mind as far as how it works with the male system. It kind of can choose, okay, do we need semen and sperm right now, or do we just need to excrete urine? So it's a rather interesting process with that. All right, last but not least, we're getting pretty close to finishing up. Some diagnostic, procedural, and laboratory terms. So again, this is very little amount of pathophys that I like to end up the unit with. Some urinary tract procedures. So first of all, dialysis. A lot of you have probably heard of dialysis before. Dialysis is a procedure done to function as your kidneys. If your kidneys are malfunctioning, you can't filter your blood. And if you can't filter your blood, you run the risk of toxins and literally killing your body just because you have too much of an accumulation of waste. So we have 2 major processes of dialysis. We have hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. Hemodialysis is the process of filtering blood outside the body in an artificial kidney machine that returns the blood back to the body after filtering. This is the more stereotypical method of dialysis treatment, where you would go to a site, a dialysis center. These are typically what they're referred to. They're found all over the country. They connect you to the machines, and you just sit there. It's supposed to be like a nice lounge chair, like TVs. They're trying to keep you preoccupied is the best word. Because obviously you're not exactly in a comfortable state. You you have to be attached to this machine that's keeping you alive. But depending on how bad or what state of your kidneys are in, you may have to go regularly to a dialysis center to get your blood filtered. So it is something to be aware of. Now, a peritoneal dialysis is going to be what we see here, the insertion and removal of a dialysis solution into the peritoneal cavity. So you see here, it's like a little IV bag connected to it. You can literally connect that to the body. Now, in some cases where the kidneys are really malfunctioning, though, people will have this taped to their body, like in their lower abdominal quadrants. And when that fills with basically urine, you just remove it and dispose of it. But it's more of a mobile process. This allows someone to be a little bit more mobile with having to get their kidneys worked on, because eventually they will need to get their kidneys worked on, but to keep them functional, to keep the body processing itself, and to keep the blood more specifically, filtering. All right, last but not least, some more terminology. These are just general terms that can be identified as far as like issues with the urinary system. So first off, we have anuresis. Typically, when you see that prefix "a" instead of some word, that's typically meaning lack of. So in this case, anuresis is going to be no urinary output. So someone struggling to urinate. Dysuria. Urea as a suffix. So I'll go ahead and just underline some of the stuff a little bit for us. So urea as a suffix is going to be indicating urine. Dysuria is just typically meaning painful urination. That may be indicative of kidney stones, which I mentioned this back in our digestive video. We discussed how, unlike gallstones, where that may require more of a surgical procedure, kidney stones, many times, unless they're that large and have gotten that out of control, do require just urinating. They will give you a solution that makes you need to urinate a lot in the day, and they not only that, but tell you drink a lot of fluids, and eventually you just urinate them out, be it male or female. Enuresis, lack of bladder control. So enuresis and polyuria sound similar because polyuria is excessive urination. Enuresis is more specific to the inability to not urinate. So what I mean by that is you may feel the urge to urinate. You may feel your bladder start to expand. Your brain's getting the signals, hey, time to find a bathroom. But for most healthy people, they get that sensation and maybe they're like, it's not really the right time. There is no bathroom, or I can wait a little bit longer. With someone suffering from enuresis, as soon as the brain starts receiving these signals, it's pretty much, okay, we're going. So that's obviously something that could be really serious there. Polyuria is more of a situation where you are urinating, you have control of your urination, but you are urinating a lot, like excessive amounts of it. So what I mean by that is, it's one thing if you drink a lot of water, a lot of fluids all day, expect to urinate. Your body needs to maintain its water balance. But if you're drinking regular levels of fluids and you're going to the bathroom an absurd amount of times to urinate, that could be an indication of polyuria. And then finally, incontinence and oliguria. Incontinence is going to be involuntary discharge of urine or feces. So obviously this could be digestive as well as far as a problem here. But this is typically a situation where the sphincter muscles are not strong enough. They've weakened, so they're not containing the urine appropriately, so some of it starts to leak. So that could obviously be an issue. And then oliguria is going to be scanty urination. Scanty urination is just indicating a pungent odor, so really negative odor. Obviously, urine doesn't smell good in the first place, but we're talking potently bad, rotten food bad. So it really can become really, really bad depending on all that stuff. And the last thing I do want to mention, as far as an interesting little tidbit, one of the things that can be an indication, a good way to identify of a really serious disease that we learned back in endocrine system, the smell of urine, if it has a sweet smell, that can actually be an indication of type 2 diabetes. So that is something that can be an early indicator. Not only sweet smell of breath or of urine, but also the breath as well. Generally speaking, that means you haven't had any sort of treatment for a while, and it's gotten pretty extreme that you can smell it on someone's breath, or obviously smell it in the urine. But that is something that can be an early indicator. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the last little tidbit I would like to share that a lot of people like to bring up in classes past, they'll say like, oh well, what about the whole like asparagus thing? Like I've heard that if you eat a lot of asparagus, it turns your urine green. Yes, it does turn it a shade of green. There's a particular compound in asparagus that your body doesn't really break down adequately enough. So when you absorb it into the bloodstream and then eventually your blood filters it because it treats it like a waste, it actually dyes the urine and it turns it like a green color. Not only are you going to notice it's a green color, but you're going to notice a smell too. The smell is going to be a little bit more distinct. Asparagus isn't the only food that does weird things like that, by the way. Carrots, which are great veggies, one of the things that can be a negative side effect of carrots if you consume a high concentration, I'm talking about way, 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 way high level of carrots, is that there's a particular compound called carotene that if you have such a high concentration of it, it actually starts to dye your skin like an orangey hue. So that's a really interesting side effect that can occur. It's nothing serious or anything like that, but your body obviously adapts to that. So that's pretty much it as far as our unit is concerned. Like I said, pretty short, 13 slides, not too bad. Next week we'll have our quiz on this stuff. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. It'll likely be Monday or Tuesday. I'm still deciding a little bit over the weekend what's gonna play out for that. But other than that, as I mentioned, I do want to try to incorporate something new, something different for this last semi-full week of class that seniors have, because right around that time, then for me at least, I'm just going to be transitioning to reproductive system, and that is a full unit. There is a Quizlet, there is a full test, et cetera, et cetera. But like typically speaking, that unit is only distributed to people that are non-seniors, because the seniors are usually already done by then. Right? So thanks for tuning in, guys.